of people connecting from more than 26 countries around the world. We feel honored to have you all here, and we do hope this initiative will keep helping you get through these difficult times. Few housewarming requests before we start. If you haven't already, please make sure to, if you're using the web version of GoToTraining, switch into the desktop one of the app by clicking on the purple flower at the top right corner of your screen. Please write your name and country of residence into the chat box. And make sure to share your feedback by filling out the survey in the end of the webinar. Before we start, I would also like to share a few words about our organization. The Global Leaders Program offers an Ivy League curated 9-month executive graduate certificate in social entrepreneurship, cultural agency, policy leadership, teaching artistry, and organizational management, led in partnership with 9 top universities, including Harvard, Duke, Georgetown, NYU, and McGill. Our faculty includes Nobel laureates, Grammy winners, and TED presenters. We have a network of institutional fieldwork partners spanning more than 40 countries. Our cohort members are musical leaders and change makers, connected by proven accomplishments, growth potential, and commitment to excel. It is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome our today's special guest presenter, Dr. Norman E. Rosenthal. Dr. Rosenthal is a world-renowned psychiatrist, public speaker, and best-selling author who is known for his innovative research and inspirational writings. He is currently clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University School of Medicine. Welcome, Professor Rosenthal.
Thank you.
He has practiced psychiatry for over 3 decades, treating people with all manner of psychiatric and emotional health issues. He is also a motivational speaker and a personal and professional coach, working with people from all walks of life, including CEOs, top athletes, and performing artists. Today's discussion will be moderated by Deborah Wanderley dos Santos, violinist, educator, founder of numerous music initiatives, and member of the GOP Advisory Council. We are also joined by guest speakers who will open the Q&A with Dr. Rosenthal. Suzanne Fiskel, GOP Advisory Board Member and Vice President and COO at the Asia Foundation. Ken McLeod, GOP Advisory Board Member, CEO of Systema New Brunswick. And Julia Schulte-Strathaus, violinist and a specialist in cognitive and clinical neuroscience, pursuing her PhD at Maastricht University. Julia will also act as a co-moderator of today's discussion. Welcome all, welcome again. And Deborah, now is the time to take over. Deborah, we cannot hear you yet.
Hello, everybody.
Now, yes, thank you.
I would like to remind everyone that you are most welcome to write your questions on the chat box. And please do so by saying your name, and also we would love to hear where you are writing from. Julia Hental, for sure.
And everybody else here, I'm having difficulty.
Deborah, unfortunately, again, we had some difficulties with hearing you.
It seems like the transmission is not really smooth. There's some kind of slowness about the internet connection.
Yeah, I'm afraid we are having some tech issues. Deborah, how about now?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me now?
That's good.
Yes, now it's good. Thank you.
Perfect. Some adversities here. I don't know how much you heard from me. Nothing at all?
No. Now we're hearing everything, but before we heard nothing.
Okay. Well, hello, Dr. Rosenthal. Hello, Julia. Hello, all of you around the world. I would like to remind you that you can please write your questions on the chat box. And also by doing so, tell us your name and where you're writing from. Dr. Rosenthal, one of the great gifts of this diversity for sure is being able to have this conversation with you. Thank you for being so kind in giving your time, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from you on how to go through this diversity with more emotional strength.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Would you like to start your presentation?
Absolutely. You're ready? I'm ready.
I'm ready.
So obviously, this is a good time for us to be asking this question, because all around us, we do see adversity. I mean, some of it is really terrible. You know, people suffering physically, people dying, downturns in the economy, and for musicians and other people who rely upon being in places where a lot of people can gather together, it can be a really major impact that can really affect your creativity, your livelihood, your passion. But the point of the lecture is to say, you know, sometimes when things seem really, really bad, some good can come out of it. And so today's talk is to say, how are the best ways that people cope with adversity, regardless of whether it's physical or financial or creative? How have people succeeded in understanding what the adversity consists of and what options are available to us? That's the thrust of my talk. And I'm really honored to be here with so many creative, talented, successful young people and have the opportunity to share a little bit of my own experience with all of you. Okay, so we're going to talk about the psychological impact of COVID, the strategies for management, and is there a gift? And if so, how do we find it? This was a book that I wrote on the subject. And how did I come to write such a book? Well, you know, as we go through life, we find that we learn certain things from our experiences. So as I went through life, I kind of looked for what things did I learn that nobody taught me, things that came out of my own experience. And when I looked at it and analyzed it, I found that I learned the most when things went wrong. When there was some problem, that's when I really learned. And all of the stories that I put together had that unifying theme. And that became my book, The Gift of Adversity. And the good news now with electronics is that you can easily get it on the Kindle or whatever, in case you should be interested. It tells the story of my own growth, upbringing in South Africa, movement to the United States, the problem of immigration, getting to comfortable with a new culture, what I learned along the way, some heroes, personal heroes of mine who taught me important lessons, and also one of the adversities is saying goodbye to people. Sometimes it may be just goodbye for a little while, but sometimes it may be goodbye permanently. So these are some of the adversities that I discuss, and we'll talk a little more about that. Nietzsche said, "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger." That's now become a famous song. I think the singer Katy Perry has used it in one of her songs, and it's true. You know, if it doesn't do us in, then maybe we'll get some good out of it. So that is also echoed by Shakespeare, who says, "Sweet are the uses of adversity, which like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head." That shiny thing in the head of the venomous toad, that may be the gift of the adversity. So we'll look here for the shiny jewel. Do I advance this or do you advance this, Deborah?
Please go ahead.
Some unseen person, an unseen hand, like the economy. You know, the economy is supposed to be the unseen hand that causes everything to move. Well, we'll depend on your, Pedro will depend on your unseen hand to move the slides.
Correct.
Adversity can come out of bad luck. Anybody can have bad luck. But sometimes we bring it on ourselves. We make mistakes. We make bad judgments. That's part of living. Which of us has lived and not made some mistakes? And then, of course, sometimes when we get adversity, it's when we look for adversity. You know, I'm sure many of you who are musicians, you could have been social workers, you could have been accountants, you could have had very steady incomes, probably from very easy professions. Being a musician at a competitive level is very, very difficult. So there's some adversity that you've actually sought out, but you did it because of a passion. And a lot of people actually look for adversity because it's a necessary step to go through in order to accomplish your dreams. It's part of what we call the hero's journey. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay. Let's look at the psychological impact of COVID. Nearly half the people in the United States feel that the coronavirus is harming their mental health. A recent survey. Okay, next. What are the psychological impacts? There's fear for your safety, for yourself and for others, financial fear, anxiety, uncertainty. Back a little bit. Isolation and loneliness, lack of structure, disorganization, deprivation and loss. That's quite a list, isn't it? It's a lot of things. And so we'll talk about them in turn. Next. Okay, somebody once said that worry is the interest paid in advance on a debt you may never owe. So let's think about that for a minute. You may say, what happens if the coronavirus sticks around for several years and I don't get any jobs and people forget about me and so on and so forth? Those are things that may never come about. All you know, when the coronavirus is gone, people may be hungry to get together in concert halls and chamber music halls and places where they can drink in the sound of music again, now that the virus is under control. So you may worry about these things, but these may be problems that never occur. So as you get anxious and you find your mind going down the rabbit hole of fears and anxieties, remind yourself, they may never happen. So don't pay interest on them in advance. Next. Isolation. Well, we didn't watch her isolation for very long. She is it possible for me to run these slides, Pedro? Is there a clicker I can use?
No, you would have to share your screen.
All right, so I'll just say next, okay?
Okay, fantastic.
All right, so it's lonely. You know, many of us are in quarantine. Many of us are social isolation. I know I am, for example. Maybe some of you are as well. I'm very hesitant to mix with anybody and everybody because there's the silent fear that is, you know, we know it can be asymptomatic for a while and still be contagious. So we isolate ourselves, but it's not easy. And events like this, where we reach out to one another and share our humanity with one another, are very important. Touching base with old friends, touching base with new friends, just reconnecting. We humans have a need for connection. I went walking with my son this morning. We were about 10 foot apart because with masks on, because he's quarantining with his family and I'm quarantining with mine. And so we were walking and he came too close. And I said, either get further away or come nearer so I can give you a hug, because I think we're all craving this real human closeness and contact, but at the same time, we're legitimately afraid. This is a legitimate fear. It's also a little bit different, because if you're younger, it's not such a bad illness, but if you're older, then it can be the last illness you're going to have. And a lot of people who come to concerts and the opera and so on and so forth may be people who are a little older. So that's your audience. So isolation and difficulty to get performances, that is part of what we're dealing with. Next. So one of the things is to accept that the adversity has occurred. Every time you say to yourself, oh, I wish this wasn't so, or isn't it terrible that things are this way? Can you remember when they were better and I wish that they would be better again? Well, you know, that it's very human to say that. But such wishes and, oh, wouldn't it be better? Yeah, it would, but it isn't. Accept what it is. You know, the new expression, it is what it is quite a good expression, because that's what we're stuck with. Doesn't mean we have to be happy, incidentally, but acceptance is a first step to tackling adversity. Next. This is the Road Runner, famous cartoon where the wolf is going over the cliff. And the joke there is that he doesn't fall until he notices that there's nothing underneath him. And of course, in real life, that doesn't work that way. We'll fall if there isn't anything underneath us, whether we notice it or not. So we may as well accept that we're coming near the edge of the cliff and pull back. So next, please. Analyze the situation, including perhaps your contribution. You know, is there anything I can do with this adversity? And then, of course, that'll be a clue as to how you're going to reverse it. Next slide. This is an example of one of the crashes that occurred, the Wall Street panic of the early 20th century, the Great Depression, so-called. We may be actually seeing it again. And next slide, please. This is the Dow Jones Industrial Average for the last 60 plus years. And this thing that you see, this big blip over there, right towards the beginning, you know, you can see the run up where there was an escalation of purchasing and then suddenly a crash. People jumped off buildings. They were so depressed and afraid. But anyway, if you look at that curve, it went all the way up after that, steadily. And so if you were to have sold all your shares at the bottom, that would have been a mistake. Holding on turned out to be a good policy, but proper analysis of the catastrophe or the tragedy. So analyze your circumstance, use a very cold-blooded analytical view of what's going on and figure out how best to handle it, not for today or for tomorrow, but for next year and the year after. In 2 years' time, my guess, you know, I'm not betting any money on it, but my guess is that in 2 years' time, COVID will not be what it is now. Because even in the last couple of weeks, we've seen certain changes in the situation. There's been one drug that's been somewhat helpful, remdesivir, just come out in the last couple of weeks that it can be useful. It's becoming a first-line treatment. And another drug just in today's newspaper. So the whole world of science is focused on fixing this problem. And they're coming up with creative solutions week by week. So there's a lot to be hopeful for, but we've got to get through in the meanwhile. So focus on how we do that. How do we manage in the meanwhile? Next, please. Proportion your response according to the nature of the adversity. You know, some people can say, oh, this is terrible. We're never going to be okay again. Doom and gloom. And other people say, well, wait a sec. Here's a way that we can survive for the next week, for the next month, for the next year. And let's keep practicing. Let's keep our social contacts going. Let's keep ourselves, let's keep our art alive in one form or another. So be proportionate. Next slide, please. This slide shows a man with a shotgun aimed at a mouse hole. So he's waiting for the mouse to come out of the hole so that he can get him with a shotgun. That is a disproportionate response. Block up the hole, put a mouse trap there, use a proportionate response. Don't waste your energy overdoing the response. Next slide. Regulate your emotions and stabilize your physiology. What do I mean by that? Next slide, please. Excuse me, this should not be working. Next slide, please. Okay, before. Okay, so here are 4 emotions. They aren't all mentioned there, but the first is angry. The second is lonely, hungry, and tired. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. HALT, H-A-L-T. Now, if I were talking to the audience and I could see everybody's responses, I would say, put up your hands. How many recognize that? Because those are common emotions recognized by people in 12-step programs. People who maybe have addictions with alcohol or overeating or drugs or sex or anything, realize that sometimes when they're getting their addictive craving, their physiology is out of control. And they need to recognize the feelings associated with being out of control. If you're angry, if you're hungry, if you're lonely, if you're tired, you know, let's say you've got an eating problem. You're angry, you go to the fridge. You're hungry, of course you eat. You're lonely, well, you go and see what's in the freezer. You're tired, well, instead of going to bed and taking a nap, you have something to eat, or you have some coffee or a latte or something to get yourself moving again. The idea is to try to see what your emotion is and respond appropriately. If you're angry with excuse me, I don't know, I'll turn this thing off, pardon me. So the point is, I need to have one of you here to help me turn my cell phone off. That's the trouble when you're operating in a virtual space, right? It's silent. If you're angry with a friend, talk to your friend, work out the anger, handle it directly. Don't go to the fridge. What happens to a cell phone if you put it in the bathroom, in the bathtub? Congratulate me, I succeeded in turning it off. See, that's why we need you young people to help us with our machinery. If you're lonely, reach out to a friend. If you're tired, get a nap. So we're regulating our physiology all the time. Next, please. Cultivate good habits. I was walking down Central Park West sometime, and actually just talking about it makes me feel nostalgic, because I think of Manhattan, which has always been such a hive of vibrancy and activity. And those musicians of yours who've played in Carnegie Hall or learned at Juilliard know about what an amazing center of culture it is. And of course, now it's been so devastated by COVID. The streets are, you see Times Square all empty and stuff, but it'll come back again. I was walking down Central Park West one day, and I saw on a church billboard a statement by the American author Annie Dillard. Next slide, please. And what it said was, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. So what we do from day to day is actually what our lives consist of. And we can forget that sometimes. You know, we think, well, we'll do this today, we'll do this tomorrow, and one day down there, we'll live our life. No, Today is our life. And if you look at your day, it is all about habits. Now, I know talking to musicians, habits are ingrained in you. Your practice, your showing up, your doing what you need to do to keep your art alive. But what I really want to emphasize is that your self-care needs to be part of your practice. Your exercise, your sleep patterns, proper eating, balancing your life with some social element, meditating. You'll see all these. Next slide, please. Here they are. Strengthen your circadian rhythms. That means your sleep-wake cycle. And sometimes you can do that by having bright light in the morning and dim light in the afternoon or evening to help you keep awake when you're supposed to and sleep when you're supposed to. Get enough sleep, eat regularly, exercise and meditate. I must tell you that I try and live by my own advice, and all these things are things that really I depend on. I now realize that I personally need 8 hours of sleep, and a lot of people do. But the fact is we shortchange ourselves. We're up at 11 o'clock at night, and maybe instead of going to bed, we start binge watching something on Netflix. And you know, when you're young, you can sort of get away with it, but not as much as you think you can. We think we can get away with more than we can, and then we kind of try to compensate with coffee or things that stimulate us and keep us going. But proper care of the self is part of the habits. It's as important as practicing your instrument or practicing your profession and discipline. And I think it's one thing, as I think back, I wasn't as mindful of it as now with the benefit of hindsight. I'm trying to share that with you. Now, of course, the younger body and mind takes punishment better than the older body and mind, but still, nobody is invincible. So bear that in mind. Meditation is fantastic. When I started to learn, it was like I'd really accomplished a real new sense of being able to grow my feelings and my thinking in a new way. So I would really encourage it. The kind of meditation I do is transcendental meditation, but there are many different kinds, and I encourage you to explore them and see whether that may be something that helps you personally. Next slide, please. These are some of the benefits of transcendental meditation, and I'm not going to go into detail, but basically it's physically, mentally. But I will point to the bottom triangle. You see the bottom triangle? That is the famous triangle of Maslow, his hierarchy of needs. And what he did is he made this triangle, and at the bottom are the basic needs. You know, the need to get your food, your sleep, your shelter, social connectedness, etc. But you see that little purple thing right at the top? That's what he calls self-actualization. Let's see at the next slide no, go back one slide. I want to quote to you what self-actualization is. And I'm pulling from my book on meditation called Transcendence. And it is here. All right, so I'll have to, here you are. And I'm glad to find it because it starts off with the word musicians. Musicians must make music. Artists must paint. Poets must write if they are to be ultimately at peace with themselves. What human beings can be, they must be. They must be true to their own nature. This is what we may call self-actualization. So that's that little triangle right at the top. But even though it's a little triangle, it is so important. Milton, the poet, wrote little poem on his blindness. And in it, he says, he speaks of that talent, which is his writing, that talent which is death to hide. There is a parable in the Bible about hiding one's talent under a bush or under a bushel, and he says that to hide your talent is really like death, because that is the degree of pressure that an artistic person has to express your art. So we shouldn't minimize this time out, but let us hope it is just a time out. Remember, things are happening. The world is changing. Scientists are working on the problem. It's going to be okay. So keep your hope alive, keep your skills alive, and most of all, keep your health alive. And that's not only your physical health, but your well-being, your mental health. That's really the central message that I'm trying to give you today. All right, Pedro, I can see you want that next slide, so let's bring it up. That is a friend, James Pennebaker, a professor of psychology in Texas, and he has done wonderful work on the value of writing as a way of processing your deepest emotional feelings and thoughts. So even if you do it, this is a simple exercise, even if you do it 4 times for 20 minutes, so that's an hour and a half. It's an exercise that all of us can do over a week or a 10-day period, just on 4 occasions. Take a scratch pad, just like this. Doesn't have to be a fancy journal with leather binding or anything. And then just write your deepest thoughts and feelings. And don't worry about the sentence structure or the choice of words. Nobody's going to read this. It's just for you. Just write down what you're feeling, what you're thinking for 20 minutes. And do it 4 times. And you never have to put it in a diary or come back to it, because the point is not to make a manuscript that's going to be valuable, but the point is the writing itself. Because when we feel feelings, we're doing it largely with our right hemisphere, right cerebral hemisphere. And when we think about things and analyze it, we do it with our left cerebral hemisphere. So when we're taking our deep feelings and bringing it together with our thinking, we are creating a synthesis between left and right hemispheres. We are processing information in a way that deepens it. I remember speaking with him for writing my own books, speaking with Pennebaker, and I said, can you give me some examples? He said, well, yeah. He said, you know, we looked over people's writing, and there was one engineer, and one time he wrote, so you do it 4 times in all, that's it. One time he wrote, they were all laid off. These were Texas Instrument workers who were laid off all of a sudden, out of work, no money, off you go, we're not interested. And they took these people and they gave them the writing exercise. So one time he wrote, laid off work, must tell girlfriend. And the next time he wrote, he said, last writing episode was very, very helpful. Okay, now you wouldn't think that just writing laid off work, must tell girlfriend, what's so helpful about that? So they got him in and they said, now, how did that help you? He said, well, you know, I've been going out with this girl and I was laid off my job, and I realized that maybe I would need to move to another town, and maybe that would put our relationship in danger. Maybe I would have to break up and it would be awful. And I didn't want to really face that until I wrote it down. And then I realized that I must tell her that this is an important thing. I can't keep it hidden any longer. And that was helpful in resolving the issue. So just a little thing you can do, very simple. Costs you absolutely nothing. Scratch pad, a pen, 4 20-minute sessions over a week or 10 days. How far wrong can you go? And here is an invitation. I don't know how you communicate with Pedro, but if anything I say here helps you in any way, I would love to hear that, because I want to be helpful, I want to be useful, and I want to know what works and what doesn't work. So please give me feedback. That's not just Deborah and Julia, but anybody out there whom I can't see right now. If anything I say is helpful, please let me know. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going down the keys to handling adversity. You accept that it's occurred, you analyze the situation, you proportion your response according to the nature of the adversity, you regulate your emotions, you stabilize your physiology, cultivate good habits, reach out for help. There is nothing wrong with reaching out for help. It doesn't mean you're weak, it doesn't mean you're needy, it means you're human. All of us need help at some point along the way. Sometimes we need help from a stranger. It's really strange. Sometimes we need help from a stranger. And you never know where help is going to come from. In my book, The Gift of Adversity, I remember when I was back in South Africa, I had to go to the army to train, because if I didn't, when I returned to visit my elderly parents, they could have grabbed me and put me in prison or brought me in the army. So I had to do it. And in the first week, I injured my back. So I had a bad back, but they were unsympathetic. And we had an exercise where two guys pair up with each other, and the one guy carries the other one on his back across a long field. And then you jump off, and then the other guy who's been carrying you climbs on your back, and you bring him back the other way. And they're somewhere off on the side. The officers are off on the side watching that everybody's doing this. So I pick somebody who looks more or less my size, and he says, okay, you can jump on first. So I did, and he hauls me across with no problem at all. And then I get off and I look at him, and I didn't realize this was a very heavily built, heavy set guy. And, oh my God, how am I going to put this person on my back? I'm going to be a wreck. And without saying a word, he just saw the expression on my face, and he said, don't worry, you jump back on and I'll take you all the way back. They'll never know the difference. Which I did. Carried me all the way back, and I jumped off and said, thank you. And I don't know what his name was. I never heard from him again. That was a total stranger who basically saved my back. You know, they say, I've got your back. Well, he had my back on that day. And so you never know. So don't hesitate, reach out, get help. Next slide. And tell a story. So don't forget the writing exercise of Dr. Pennybaker. 4 sessions, scratch pad, pen, 20 minutes each, an hour and a half, deepest thoughts and feelings. Don't worry about sentence structure. Don't worry about grammar. It's not there for anybody to read. It's just there to help you process your feelings with the benefit of your powerful left analytic hemisphere. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are these gifts that I've been talking about? Next slide. Deficits. Okay, insight and strengthening of other areas. You know, sometimes when you can't do something well, you get insight, and it helps you to strengthen the things that you do well. You know, so maybe you are maybe you're a brilliant musician, but maybe you're terrible at organization, and you don't get your taxes done, and you don't get things done that you should. You're disorganized. That disorganization might help you if you're teaching somebody, say you're a violinist, and or a pianist, make it simple. You're teaching someone to play the piano, and this person just doesn't get it. They're a bit tone deaf. They're not picking up. And you may be very impatient because you may think, wow, you know, it's so easy for me. Why is he or she struggling so? Remember how disorganized you are. remember that that's a deficit that you've got, and it gives you an insight into why your pupil is struggling. He or she just doesn't have the musicality that you have, just like you don't have that organizational skill. Everybody's different. I use that all the time as a psychiatrist. Maybe I'm really good in some ways, but maybe I'm terrible in other ways. And I remember how terrible I am at swinging a golf club, for example, how they could never really teach me because I just didn't have that spatial ability. It made me a better psychiatrist because now I can understand somebody who doesn't recognize emotions, somebody who can't express their feelings in words, people who have difficulties that I can help them with. So deficits give you insight into yourself and into other people. They're very valuable. Use every deficit. Don't let a deficit go to waste. Next slide, please. Suffering causes empathy. Remember how you suffered when you couldn't learn something. Maybe it was math. Maybe you couldn't learn the quadratic equation. I can empathize with this person who just can't sing in tune or whatever. So, or empathize, you know, you suffered, you were hungry once, you had no money. Now you've got plenty of money, but maybe somebody else doesn't. Remember how hard it was. So that's a value of adversity. It helps with empathy. Next slide. Trauma causes growth. Something terrible happens to you. Well, you can learn from that, you know? My book is full of examples of things that I personally suffered, where I grew from each and every one of them. Each and every one of them made me a better person. You know, they say when you break a bone, it grows stronger at the broken parts when the bone heals. That's a good metaphor for the psychological benefits of trauma. Next slide, please.
Dr. Rosenthal, may I comment on this?
Of course. I'm so glad.
I thought it was so interesting when I was reading about you and your work, where I saw this idea of post-traumatic stress growth instead of just post-traumatic stress disorder, how this can shift for such a bloom in a person's life. It was very interesting.
Well, thank you. Do you have any specific question about it or any specific thing I can elaborate about?
Yes, well, as the musicians community, we are very much in fear. There was just an article in the newspaper today that on Monday, several organizations in Brazil are going to either cut salaries or reduce our salaries, or just people are just going to go unemployed. And we have been hearing now for maybe 40 days of quarantine that musicians now have to reinvent ourselves and to take this time to really learn about new abilities. And it's interesting that even though this is such a hard time, there seems to be a movement all around that people are connecting much more. They're coming together online through lives on Instagram, and people are learning how to deal with technology, learning how to teach online. And musicians have always been trained a little bit to suppress the difficult emotions. So we're supposed to go on stage, and even though we are in such fear, we must perform excellently. And maybe this goes into our personal lives as not being so able to deal with fear and see the opportunity in this. And what would be some maybe exercises that we can take into transforming this fear into action?
Well, yes, that's a beautiful exposition of the challenge, and so glad you brought it up. Well, the exercise I already gave you, the writing exercise, is one, but it doesn't have to be writing. But you could, for example, make a list of all the things. Firstly, there are things that you can do. There are specific skills. But before we even talk about the skills, what is the quality of a musician? What does a musician have to be over and above? And incidentally, I just want to share the incredible admiration I have for musicians. I've never really been very musical, so the ability to sing beautifully, or I'll tell you a story. I would sing a lullaby to my son when he was a little boy, and I would sing the lullaby, and he would look at me and say, "No, Dad, it doesn't go like that. This is how it should really sound." And he would sing it back to me all right on note. He's got his mother's musicality. So I would have this incredible admiration for your musicality. But more than that, look at the other things you've got. Discipline, being able to keep your goal in mind and focus on your goal, not afraid to work hard. Being able, yes, suppress your emotion when you go on stage, fine, or bring it out in your music. If you're playing a sad piece or whatever, but obviously if you've just had a fight with your boyfriend, partner, whatever, obviously you're not going to take that out on your music. You've learned how to compartmentalize that. But I think all these are very impressive life abilities that you've learned besides the specific skills. So and you're creative people. You think of ways. Becoming a successful musician, as you know, this is not easy. And so you've got all this background in terms of finding your way, and all the time at the back of your mind to remember, COVID is not here forever. COVID is going to get solved one way or the other. Pandemics always do. The important thing is to keep yourself alive, healthy, mentally healthy, keep your talent alive, and financially healthy in the meanwhile. So that's the message that I would give you. And this growth from trauma is very real. It's very real. People become very strong as a result of having had to struggle. We'll talk a little more about that, but something to remember. Anything else?
Oh, there's so much to ask, but if you would like to continue, I'll save the questions.
I haven't got very much left, and then I really want to be open to questions, because I love the questions, because if somebody's asking a question, I know that's something that really is going to be useful to somebody. So everybody out there, be ready with your scratch pads, write down your questions so you don't forget them. We're going to come back to that soon. Next slide, please. Obstacles lead to creativity. They say necessity is the mother of invention. You can think of anything you can think of, any invention you can think of is the result of some creativity. They say that the man who created the cheese knife, that is a knife where you can cut the cheese and spear it with the end, which is a fork. They said it was invented by a one-handed man who didn't want to have to kind of change hands, and now I'll pick up the knife, now I'll pick up the fork. He didn't want to change instruments, want to hold one instrument, so he invented the cheese knife. So necessity is the mother of invention. Next slide. And setbacks give you wisdom. In fact, just in writing the book, it made me realize that, after a while, when you collect enough of these life experiences, they kind of cluster together, and you think, I've got something for my years. I've learned something, and it stands me in good stead. So next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at the three kinds. Next slide, bad luck. Next slide. Okay, we've skipped a couple of slides. They've been left out somehow, which is strange, but it happens. If you're walking along 6 feet apart, you've got your mask on, and you get COVID, that's bad luck. You've done everything right. You've done what you can. Somehow the virus got through. Okay. But if you're going out on the beach and partying when everybody's telling you it's dangerous and you get COVID, that's not bad luck, that's bad judgment. And so we need to take some responsibility. But the third kind of adversity is the hero's journey. There you are. The quest for excellence. And to some extent, that's your journey, because you are all doing something heroic, becoming a successful performing musician. That's not an ordinary course. That's not becoming a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer. Those are much more well-trodden paths to get to having a decent living and a middle-class existence. But no, when you're a musician, you aspire to somehow be an artist, hopefully a great artist. So it's a quest for excellence. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Oh, no, go back. That's a good one. This is Aristotle's great quote. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. So in other words, you don't come out and play a brilliant musical piece without having practice. And I've seen musicians at great levels of skill, and the hours, and I hardly need to tell you, but I was amazed. For one of my books, I interviewed someone who's become a friend, the classical guitarist Sharon Isbin. And she explained to me how long it took her to put together a piece of music so that every note was absolutely perfect. It was really daunting to listen to. Next slide. All right, I think we're going to leave that one and that one. But we're going to go to this one. These are heroes. These are heroes of our day. They are on the front lines of the epidemic. Doctors, nurses, emergency technicians, even people who are exposing themselves. The person behind the deli counter who is making sandwiches for people all day long. She or he is exposing himself, herself to exposure. Some people don't even want to go into a store, understandably, and this person is going there every single day. So these are the heroes of this epidemic, and they're going to help us get through. Next slide, please. Nelson Mandela, from the country of my origin, South Africa, he was a hero. He deliberately sought out a very difficult path. He sought out adversity in order to bring freedom to all South Africans. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we're seeing people who are being creative in their adversity. They're out on their balcony, they're playing their musical instruments. They are holding on to their art, or maybe teaching. Maybe one of them is teaching another one, I don't know. Next slide, please. Or they're playing on the internet for other people. People are listening to them and enjoying their music. I wanted to play the Rotterdam Symphony Orchestra performs the Ode to Joy, where all the different musicians playing their individual instruments finally come together and they play it all together. It's very moving, but I was told that the technology would not support it. Excuse me. So anyway, next slide, please. Be creative is the thing. Okay, here is one great hero of mine. Viktor Frankl wrote this marvelous book, Man's Search for Meaning. He was a Holocaust survivor whom I had the privilege of meeting when he was in his 90s at the end of the last century. And he came out of the Holocaust. He came out alive with his mind intact. And he came out with actually a philosophy that people can take away from you anything except your right to make a choice in whatever circumstance you are in. You can make some choice as to how you want to respond. So here we are, and if he could come out of this incredible trauma with some message that does people good, what an inspirational story that is for all of us, that we can come out of this horrible situation with something of value, something that can make us better people, something that we can share with other people. And there's a great joy in being able to share with other people the gifts of your own experience. That's what I encourage all of you to take away. Next slide. And the next slide. This is more Viktor Frankl. What is to give light must endure burning. Anything that is to illuminate can also be painful and even destructive. So that's where we are today. It's my joy and privilege to be here with all of you, and very happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenthal. It seems that we need to have very strong minds in terms of health, but also in action, in creativity. And it's interesting to me that emotional intelligence, we are not used to thinking of that as a skill that can be trained and strengthened. Could you please share a few words about learning this new skill and developing our emotional intelligence consciously?
Yes, I think so. You know, emotional intelligence is so important. Now, let's talk about advancing through a hierarchy. The need to be mindful and considerate of other people's feelings, to be tactful, to be appropriate with supervisors, in other words, how to play your chips properly in regard to the political maneuvering that we all have to do, regardless of our hierarchy, how to be appropriately respectful and obedient, but at the same time maintain our own sense of self-respect and boundaries. This is all emotional intelligence. And it's not always easy to navigate. Sometimes we need to share with a friend, ask somebody advice. How would you, manage in this situation? How am I respectful without being a patsy? How am I going to be assertive without seeming like I'm being aggressive? These are all very tricky things. And as I'm talking, I don't know why, but maybe I'm wrong. You can tell me. I think for women, it's especially tricky to navigate through systems. I think somehow I've seen it's easier for men than for women because, friendliness can be mistaken, misinterpreted. It's a very tricky thing, and I would almost hope that there are special classes in how to play the game, as it were, because it's an emotional game, But you tell me, am I right or am I off track here? Deborah, tell me what you think.
Well, I think you are right. It's very difficult, especially in the workplace. I feel that I cannot be as friendly to my male colleagues as the other male colleagues can. It's very tricky. And in an orchestra where we are together, 90, 100 people all the time together, it's very difficult to navigate. I also wish there were some classes and courses on that.
Julia, what do you think?
Well, this is a slippery slope, I think, of a topic. I'd have to say it depends on the situation, but I'm not sure if from an evolutionary account, if there's much to say about females navigating different emotional systems in comparison to males. Keeping in mind that different emotions serve different evolutionary reasons as well. So it's a tricky question.
I think that that's very profound what you're saying, that there are evolutionary forces at work here. But I think I think, I mean, when we're talking about emotional intelligence, this is the sphere that we're operating in. How does one use one's emotions and, you know, because, you know, men can be friendly to other men, they can be appropriately deferential, they can be appropriately assertive. Somehow it seems easier. I don't know, maybe because I'm a man and I'm looking over this divide to what women have to struggle with. But I don't think so, because I know that as a therapist, as a psychiatrist, I've had patients and clients say to me, you know, this person is misinterpreting what I'm doing, what I'm saying. How can I, you know, how can I tell this person, you know, this is just a colleague relationship, this is just a friendly relationship, and I have no interest in it being anything more than that, without upsetting him, without injuring his ego. How can I maneuver through these tricky waters here? And I think it is a question of emotional intelligence, but I would check in with friends or mentors. I think to have a female mentor would be very useful in that regard. And I think that men can have female mentors who are very, very wonderful because they give you the opposite point of view. And women can have male mentors who are very wonderful, as long as boundaries are respected. That's the key there. Suzanne, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, actually, the first question I wanted to ask you was around this, and I'll just, instead of asking that question, I have another one. But before I do, I supervise many, many people, 900 people all over the world, and we've been trying to keep in touch over the last many weeks. And my female colleagues have said that it's a lot easier in a remote situation to get other female colleagues to talk about how they're feeling and to share. And what they've come up with, not me, especially for men who are proud of their own, you know, kind of machismo, if I can use that word, or they don't normally share their feelings. What my colleagues have been doing is saying, what's the word of the week? And they just ask for one word from everybody, but especially from the men. And they found that's a good way for guys who don't normally want to express any feelings to be able to say something, and they use that as a starting point if it helps the conversation. So I don't know if that's useful, but for people who are not sort of touchy-feely, coming up with one word that kind of captures their feelings has been quite helpful, and been helpful for other people to interact with them. But I have a different question, but it's also about interpersonal relationships, and this is that I don't know who all is on the call, but I know you're musicians. Many of you, I think, are also teachers, and you probably supervise other people, and I'm sure you do as well, Dr. Rosenthal. You know, as people who work with others, and we're in a teaching or a supervisory role, we always have to provide guidance and feedback, and that's not always positive. Sometimes you need to say things that people don't want to hear. But when you're in person and you're saying things that are often difficult, you know, facial expressions and physical gestures may be helpful and may soften the blow or may make it easier to understand. But for many of us working remotely, our gestures and our expressions are invisible. So I wonder if you have some thoughts about how to provide candid guidance and feedback remotely in a way that achieves the intended positive impact, but doesn't just add to emotional stress. Is that something that I wonder if that's something that our colleagues on the phone are dealing with, and whether you have some suggestions for ways to provide in this long-term, you know, distancing where we're not just apart for a few days, but we may have very long-term supervisory or teaching relationships that have to rely on remote technology. How do you give feedback that's really helpful but may not be positive? That's an absolutely fabulous question, really, for a couple of reasons. The first is that when we're in two dimensions, it kind of flattens us, you know. So
it's strange to say, but I was kind of pleased that my phone fell and that I fetched a book off the shelf, because you saw that I really am in 3 dimensions here. I'm not just a flat thing on a screen. And I think that in a real way, the screen flattens us, so it distorts us. I think I've worked as a therapist and I've worked as a coach, and it's a little bit different. You know, let's say, and as a therapist, it's a skill because you want to give feedback in a way that it's going to be heard. So let's say there's a man who says his wife, my wife is always screaming at me. Now, I know already she's not just screaming for nothing. And so I could easily say, what are you doing that makes her scream? I would never say that, because he would fire me on the turn, because I wouldn't be sympathizing with him being screamed at. I would say, you know, that must be really awful. How does it feel? And he might say, well, it doesn't feel good. I come home after a hard day's work and all I want is a couple of whiskeys. And before I know it, she's screaming at me. So I think, aha, okay, he's drinking a couple of whiskeys. What's that doing to him? So I say, well, you know, how does that feel when you have a couple of whiskeys? Well, it kind of feels better. I say, oh, that's good. And when she screams, what will she say? Well, maybe she says, come to the dinner table already. The food's getting cold. I'm just making this up. And I say, oh, she cooks dinner for you, reminding him that somebody's doing something nice for him. She cooks dinner for you. He says, yeah. I say, well, what kind of food does she serve? She's pretty good, actually. She cooks what I like. So, oh, that's nice. So you're telling me she kind of wants you to have a nice dinner, right? So I'm leading him to understand that this person is doing something very nice for you and they want you to enjoy it. So maybe they want you to eat it while it's still warm. So I'm taking him along a circuitous route that will make him empathize with her, instead of saying, you know, you callous, whatever. Somebody's cooking for you and you're screaming, you know what I'm saying? So I think to empathize with where the person is coming from is one of the things to do. Now, when you're coaching, they're coming to you for coaching because there's certain things that need to be encouraged and there are other things that need to be discouraged. I mean, are you coaching music, Suzanne? Is that your area, or are you just coaching them to function as in systems or operate in the workplace?
Yeah.
Okay, so and they're doing things that are repeatedly, you know, what's often helpful is when you can point out a pattern. This supervisor is giving me a hard time. Is it like the last supervisor who also gave you a hard time? Yeah, it's kind of the same. And what's similar about it? Well, they both, just because I showed up 5 minutes late, they throw a hissy fit at me because I come 5 minutes late. Well, what do you think of that? You know, I kind of try and bring it out of them. I try and see, have they got any insight and not come, but then sometimes I might not have the time. I might just be real with them and say, you know, I think you're going to find this repeatedly, that if you're late for people, they interpret it as disrespectful. You may think of it as, well, you know, it's my time, so I can, if I'm 5 minutes late, you know, and that's how you think. But they might be seeing it in a different way. They might take it that you're not valuing them. So I might just give them a reality check. And, you know, I wouldn't think somebody would be angry at me for just saying, look, this person's seeing it in a different way than you are. But I always try and avoid eliciting an angry response. If I have a sense that this is going to cause anger, I try and avoid it. Not because I'm afraid of making people angry, but because when people get angry, they often don't learn. Do you know what I mean? They often tend to just block out what you're telling them. And that's what I don't want to have happen. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
Thank you.
Is it?
Yes. And maybe
Oh.
the music teachers have a version of that question as well. I don't know.
What you say? Tell me.
I said maybe the music teachers have a version of that kind of a question, since I'm not a music teacher.
I would love to hear from a music teacher. Anyway, I'm open to all questions. Ken, you've just appeared. Hello. We can't hear you. You have to enable your audio.
There we go, successful.
Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenthal, for this session today. Really have enjoyed it and appreciate your time. I'm from Sistema, New Brunswick in Canada. So just a little context and then a question. We started our program in 2009, so just a little over 10 years. It's a social program through music for children and youth who are largely left out in the society. And it's a very intensive program, 3 hours a day after school, 5 days a week, 10 months of the year. We started with one center and 50 kids, and we now have 10 locations in the province and 1,200 kids every day in our program.
Wow.
We have 58 teaching artists, musicians full-time on our staff team. And I can tell you over this 11 years, there have been a number of times as through our evolution as an organization where we faced really severe adversity and things that could have done us in along the way. So a couple of questions, more from the point of view of the institution or the organization. Is there a difference in how individuals respond to adversity versus how organizations respond to adversity? Does this kind of thinking that you've shared with us apply equally to individuals and organizations?
Well, that's a great question. And I would say absolutely. I think that when you've got an organization, the heads of the organizations, the people who are in positions of authority, really set the tone. So I had the honor of talking to thousands of accountants a couple of weeks ago. And the reason I did was that the head of the accounting firm is a coaching client of mine. And he asked me to speak to his organization, and which I did, more or less in a similar vein to how I'm talking to you today. And talking about how they could handle it, how they could take care of themselves. It was more about what can you do to take care of yourselves, which is a very important thing that I want to really emphasize to all of you. And he had an outpouring of gratitude from the people in his organization, that he as the leader was interested in their well-being, that he was interested in what they could take away that was positive and encouraging and inspirational, how they could take care of their emotional difficulties under the circumstances. So what I thought was happening there was that through the leader of the organization, being mindful of the feelings of his staff and the people they were serving and passing the message down through the organization, giving some tangible advice, giving some concrete hope, showing that there were ways to handle adversity that were better and worse, and the camaraderie and the fellowship of people recognizing that they were all in the same boat together. These were, I think, incredibly helpful in how they processed it. So although the specifics in terms of how it's administered and how it's passed down through a bureaucracy or an organization may differ from when you're dealing with an individual, the guiding principles are basically the same.
That's really helpful. If I could, I'll just follow up, and this is related to the question, but I think slightly different. I think the experience of adversity is different, I think, for leadership than it might be for employees. And I'll just give you an example. For myself, I think it's relatively easier than for some of the staff in our organization. I have a good home office that's really helpful. My children are adults, so I don't have other concerns and worries that those who have children at home might. I'm relatively stable financially at this point in my life, so I don't have the same kind of concerns. So I guess my question is, how do we help our teams embrace this moment, and I guess help them mentally? Some, in fact, are feeling fear. They feel anxiety. Sometimes they even feel like a failure because it takes them a while to kind of cope and deal with these situations. So maybe put another way, how do we kind of retain this kind of thinking and embed it in the organization and with the people who are our colleagues?
Well, I mean, you raise a very important question. And as a matter of fact, I was talking about this very thing with my client, the one I just mentioned earlier today, that you do have all of those things and I have all of those things. And I think it puts us in a very privileged position. On the other hand, I don't know how old you are, but if I get COVID, it's not such a good thing. Whereas if I had 30 years less, I mean, I think we would trade some of our creature comforts for an extra 30 years of biological viability. So we all have our pros and our cons. But in any event, I think that it's very important, firstly, to recognize that everybody's in a different situation. That if one is, without resources, without funds, without a place to work, without various things, that they might have a whole set of different circumstances. But that's where I think listening to what people's problems are. I mean, I don't know what the specifics are, but often answers really lie in the specifics of the solution. I'm just guessing maybe there is a place where people can come and communally use computers some distance apart from each other. That's just a guess because I don't know if such a thing exists. But listening to the specifics of a person's problems and figuring out how can we help with this or that, how could we raise some funds, how could we do this or that. I think there are two levels whereby that helps. The first level is actually helping them get the actual concrete things they need. But the second level is just showing that you care and showing that you really will do what you can to meet people where they are. I think just the feeling that one isn't alone, that the leadership is supporting you, that everybody wants you to do well, that they're limited, that even though they're in charge, it doesn't mean they're omnipotent, they have limits. And that you can talk about that and you can brainstorm together. I think these things, and you tell me whether these things make a difference, but I would think they would. How have you gotten through all your adversities that you outlined at the beginning of your comment?
That's a long story. It's a hard one. It's hard to answer in a couple of minutes. But I appreciated what you said earlier. What I found, of course, is each experience helps in the next one. You learn, you more. I guess that's been an important part of our story. I mean, we had a situation just a year ago where the loss of a single donor meant the possibility of closing 3 centers, eliminating 250 kids, and laying off 15 staff. Well, that could have been catastrophic. But in a sense, really some of your principles, after getting over the anger and the fear and all those other emotions, it was okay. There's a new normal. So given this new normal, how do we respond? How do we act? What positive steps can we take? And so those things that you mentioned were in fact very, very important part of our story in dealing with really, very trying circumstances. And in the end, it meant huge and beneficial things for our organization, as much as I wouldn't have wished that on anyone, because it was so stressful. And
we're having a little difficulty with the technology, Ken. But my sense is that there were actually some gifts, and maybe some other time I would love to hear from you some of the specifics, the particulars. It sounds like it's been quite a journey and an interesting one. Thank you.
Yeah.
Julia, would you like to ask your question now? Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Dr. Rosenthal.
Thank you. Yes. So, Dr. Rosenthal, I have 2 questions for you as well, a bit different from the questions we've received so far. But what do you think is not getting enough attention in the media at the moment?
Well, it's difficult to say because the media is so saturated, and I read a lot of the papers and I see there's a lot of attention going to a lot of different places. And just to focus on everything that is getting the attention is already flooding one's consciousness. But I haven't heard about homeless people. I've seen shots of them sleeping on the subway. I haven't heard about them. What's happening to them? Being homeless at the best of times must be difficult, but being homeless now, one wonders. It's almost like how many illnesses go undiagnosed. You don't know because they haven't been diagnosed. Do you know what I'm saying? So if I were a journalist, I would be asking that question because I would be wanting to shine a light on the place where light is not currently being shone. But it's being shone in so many different places. I guess here's a thing. Earlier today, I was describing, when should we open up the economy? When should you be able to go back to a work situation here, there, or everywhere? And my thought is, it's not a question of when, it's a question of what is a safe thing to do. We're more interested in being safe than in being on time. So I was talking to my friend about not when should you open your workplace up, but when is it safe? Well, my thought is when we've got tests and people can be tested, that's when people, I don't think somebody should go back into the workplace if they're positive for COVID. I don't think that's a safe thing to do. And I think, there's a parallel with the AIDS epidemic. When people learned what was safe to do and, what was safe sex. Well, this is what is safe work, When is it safe to go into a supermarket? What is safe? Not when is the time, but what do we need to know? So I think we just are developing the technology for understanding what is safe. So that may be a focus that hasn't perhaps been sufficiently addressed. But otherwise, your guess is as good as mine. Do you have a feeling as to what hasn't been given enough attention?
Well, we live in a digital world and certainly in a information overload.
Right.
And it's very overwhelming to really navigate everything that's out there and differentiating the good from the bad, especially if you don't have a trained eye. People are very gullible and very dangerous information can be spread very quickly and lead to terrible outcomes. I would agree with your point on the homeless people. There's no way that these people can self isolate. They're exposed. I don't hear anything about that either. So certainly some humanitarian missions and themes are still missing, I think, from the headlines. And I suppose that different people also see different news, so perhaps it's different people can have different answers to this question. I was also wondering, because I noticed that we're running a bit short on time, but perhaps in a few words, could you maybe share what does it mean to be practicing medicine right now?
Well, I think it means different things to different people, because it's one thing if you're in the emergency room on the front line without any proper protective equipment, which one of my friends, who is a psychiatrist in New York, she was very recently in the emergency room dealing with people who had psychiatric symptoms of COVID. They get delirious, they get, confused, and dealing with that and wearing just a kind of coverlet that a waitress might wear in a sort of downscale restaurant, and very shamefully inadequate. So I think that that's one situation. And another one is, here I am practicing medicine safely at my desk. So it's two very different circumstances. But I think for me, what is really wonderful about practicing medicine is the reason why I went into medicine in the first place: to help people, to alleviate suffering, to improve the quality of people's lives. So I think at this crisis time in the world, doctors can do more than ever. On the other hand, doctors must look after themselves. Recently, I don't know if you all heard, but there was an emergency room doctor, top emergency room doctor in New York, who committed suicide. She developed COVID and she committed suicide. She ran out of juice. I don't know what her circumstances were, but I think what it says to me is, if you're a healer, you really need to take care of yourself, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to take care of anybody. So just a few thoughts.
Thank you for this very complete answer. Yeah.
I do know that we're just a few minutes out of time, and I want to just thank all of you for giving me the opportunity to come and share some of my experience with you, and hope that you all stay safe, stay well, keep your dreams and hopes alive, because I think they're wonderful, and I think that this will pass, and that hopefully when they do, maybe I'll be in some concert hall somewhere or some chamber music place somewhere, and I'll recognize a face in the audience, not in the audience, on the performing stage, and I'll come up and say hello. Or if you see me anywhere, come up and say hello. It would be a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to thank all our special guests and also all our participants, and encourage you to follow our website, www.globaleadersprogram.com, as well as follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn for the latest news and new online resources that we will share next month. In May, we are launching a new series of events in collaboration with the Spanish Association of Symphony Orchestras under the name Resetting the Stage. This is a series aimed at exploring the future of orchestras and concert hall in a post-pandemic world, from public health to economics, from event production to communication strategy. Each conversation will involve a diverse group of industry experts to engage in examining next steps for the sector in the world transformed by the social distancing. This first event within the series is happening on Thursday, May 7th, and will focus on assessing the global situations, orchestras, and concert halls. We will also continue our series of continuing education Our next speaker is Sue Hoyle from CLOR Leadership and Arts Council UK. She'll talk about changing the culture of leadership and leadership of culture. This is also happening on Thursday, May 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We really do hope to see you all there. Take care, get some rest, and enjoy the weekend. See you all soon. Bye.